If you ask most Americans what was the cause of the Civil War, many will say it was the effort of the North to stop the Western expansion of slavery. Many will say it was the preservation of the Union. Some will blame tariffs and other economic differences between North and South. But the fact is that almost all historians say that slavery was the basic cause. And in fact, in his second inaugural address in 1865, Lincoln himself said that, here I'm paraphrasing a little, everybody knows that slavery was somehow the cause of the war. The trick for historians is to explain that somehow. There has always been a contradiction at the heart of American life. On the one hand, this is a nation that was founded by a document, the Declaration of Independence, that declares all men are created equal. Yet the very man who wrote those immortal words, Thomas Jefferson, owned over 100 slaves. Slavery was very powerfully entrenched in American life at the time of American independence. This contradiction played itself out in the first half of the 19th century as the country divided into a slave society and then a free society of the North. I think that anyone who studies the 19th century would agree that the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution were two of the most important documents in American history. They changed the definition of who is an American and is entitled to the rights of American citizenship, and they opened the question of race in American life and forced the federal government to begin confronting that question.
The Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863. In 1862, he had issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that essentially warned the Confederate States he would take this action if they didn't stop the rebellion. Of course, they didn't stop. He issued this proclamation, which emancipated, freed all of the slaves in Confederate-held territories.
One of the issues for the Union during the Civil War was having enough manpower and womanpower to fight the war. Lincoln could observe the number of enslaved people who were self-emancipating, that is, freeing themselves.
The proclamation includes, for the first time, the authorization of enlisting black combat soldiers in the Union Army, and arming people to fight for their own freedom certainly raised the stakes enormously in terms of debates about black citizenship. And the proclamation puts that in motion also.
13th Amendment is one of 3 amendments to the U.S. Constitution that were ratified after the end of the Civil War. And the 13th Amendment sets out clearly that formerly enslaved people are now free.
I think between the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, we see Lincoln's gradual development as an abolitionist.
The framing of his narrative as the great emancipator was something that artists and writers, printmakers, and many others wrote literally into history.
But it's important to remember he was capable of growth. He was capable of changing his mind. When the circumstances changed, Lincoln changed.
If we look at other historical figures of his same time frame, people like Frederick Douglass, who would have been in conversation with Lincoln, we know that Lincoln's attitudes towards slavery as an institution changed over time.
The Emancipation Proclamation is very different than most of Lincoln's great speeches and letters. It's really a legal document. It certainly didn't free all slaves, but it immediately set about 50,000 enslaved peoples free. And more than that, it was a major pivot in the Northern strategy of fighting the war simply to keep the Union together. It made it a war to free the slaves.
Because of the limitations of the Emancipation Proclamation, it being a temporary war measure, and also having a loophole that left many people unprotected, the 13th Amendment was necessary as a measure to declare slavery unlawful in the United States.
What does it mean to enforce the abolition of slavery? There was no consensus on this. Did it mean that African Americans would now have the same political rights, legal rights, economic rights as white Americans? This was debated. The 13th Amendment ended the debate over slavery. Part of Lincoln's greatness was this flexibility and the idea that the dogmas of the past were no longer acceptable in the violent present.
Another really interesting thing that these documents and other historical documents have done for contemporary artists working today and in the late 20th century is that it enables them to really understand how they might fit into the fabric of the nation. The representation of Black bodies, of the Black figure, has changed over time since the passage of the 13th Amendment. And I'm thinking here of contemporary African American artists like Kehinde Wiley and also Carol Walker and others who have gone back into the archive to create a certain practice that appropriates sometimes, but also relies on historical documentation to understand what's at stake at the time that they're creating the works that they are known for.
So what does it mean that Sotheby's is selling the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation? Those are concepts, but they also exist as physical artifacts. And we are selling the very earliest iterations of these documents that one can have. The Emancipation Proclamation was first issued and actually first published on January 1st, 1863. It went through many editions. However, none of those was signed by Abraham Lincoln. And the copy that we're selling now is from the only edition of the full text of the Emancipation Proclamation that he signed. Lincoln donated his original draft of the Emancipation Proclamation for a Sanitary Commission fair in Chicago. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. So this broadside printing from 1864 is really the only copy of the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Abraham Lincoln that we have today. Each copy of the 13th Amendment signed by Lincoln is unique. They're all handwritten, they're on vellum. The one that we have is particularly attractive, well-preserved, and loaded with signatures, not only of Lincoln, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, but almost all of the senators and almost all of the congressmen who voted for the 13th Amendment. It's really overwhelming to realize this was probably the greatest achievement in the political lives, not only of Lincoln, but of virtually all of the men who signed it. At Sotheby's, we're privileged to see and handle a lot of wonderful objects. What's fascinating about printings and manuscripts of great documents like the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation is that they exist as these tangible pieces of vellum and paper. We think of them as ideas, as pieces of legislation, but that's not the case. They exist as artifacts, and their physicality is very powerful and very moving, particularly when we can see them in a gallery side by side.
80 years after the American Revolution, they began the process of trying to live up to Jefferson's words about equality. So in a sense, one can look at the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment as efforts to bring American life into coordination with the values that the country proclaimed when it was founded in 1776.